I'm not so sure I'd call it superhero fatigue, but things just aren't the same anymore in the MCU. I love the first two Guardians movies. While I'm a huge fan of the MCU through Endgame, the two movies that hit home the most for me were the Guardians movies. One day I'm sure I'll make a video about how both of those are worth going back to enjoy despite the current state of the MCU, and when I do, I'll go into more specifics of the personal connections I feel for these. For now, you just have to trust that the last thing I wanted to do was dislike this movie. This was the first MCU movie I actually wanted to see as a fan since Spider-Man Far From Home. Hell, I took my whole family to see this one. Guardians 3 starts off in nowhere, the severed head of the celestial being we first saw as the home base for the Collector in the first movie. The Guardians now run the place and have set up shop there. You'll have no way of knowing this unless you watch some other crap on Disney+, which I'll get to later, so just go with it. The mood seems somber, and we soon find out why. Peter is drunk again, wallowing in self-pity over the loss of Gamora back in Infinity War. As Rocket tries to cheer him up, Adam Warlock blasts into nowhere and begins destroying everything. He overpowers everyone there, and it takes everyone involved to injure him and send him on his way, but not before Rocket has been severely hurt. While trying to revive him, they accidentally make things worse and find out that the bioengineering that makes him what he is has a reset key or something, and they have to go to the factory and get it. So the gang sets off on their quest. Before reaching their location, Ravagers show up, and Other Universe Gamora is now with them. Remember when she showed up with Other Universe Thanos in Endgame? The Guardians are there to meet her, and now we've all gotten together. The rest of the movie is pretty boilerplate stuff of breaking into places, stealing stuff they need, etc. And I do mean boilerplate. There's a scene at the first location where they need to steal a bullshit code that feels almost identical to the prison scene in the first movie, where they go to the tower and turn off the anti-gravity in the station. Only difference here is that Nathan Fillion is thrown in to, play Nathan Fillion as a guard, so if you're a big Nathan Fillion fan, there's that. Ultimately, the movie revolves around two storylines. The first is Rocket's backstory. This one fails entirely for me, mostly because I don't think it was needed. We learned in the first movie that Rocket had been made. He hadn't asked to. It must have been brutal, and he hated the way people treated him because of it. We learned in the second movie that Yondu saw through all of that, and saw that he was a loyal friend that cared deeply about the people around him, even though he acted like he didn't. Not every story needs to be fully fleshed out. And in the case of the Guardians, James Gunn had done such a masterful job of introducing these characters in the previous two movies, we already felt like we knew them entirely. But in this case, we get the backstory because it was the way to shoehorn in the latest forgettable Marvel villain, the High Evolutionary. Stretchy Face was the one that had done the experiments on Rocket, as well as hosts of other animals, with plans to create a perfect society on a world he'd created called Counter-Earth. While Rocket was ultimately the most special, he was just part of the final group of test subjects before the final version, and was to have been destroyed years ago, but he'd escaped before Stretchy Face could dissect his brain. But because Rocket was unique in that he could create and had imagination, Stretchy Face wanted him back. In addition to his experiments on all the animals, he created hosts of other races in the universe, including the Sovereign from Guardians 2, and that's why Adam Warlock had been sent to nowhere at the beginning of the movie to retrieve Rocket. The second storyline is Peter and Gamora, which never really gets fleshed out. Peter had lost the love of his life, and alternate Gamora has no feelings for him at all, which is doubly hard. So you can imagine where this goes most of the time. So let me mention what's good. The main cast is still exceptional in their roles, and that's really the only thing that carries this movie forward. Truth is, casting was an absolute home run with the first movie, and each actor has done a fantastic job with what they've been given over the 3 movies and special appearances elsewhere. The addition of Mantis in Volume 2 was very well done also. When the group is together, there's a real sense of chemistry there. The banter is mostly spot on and feels organic. But we miss some of that in Volume 3 because we lose Rocket for much of the movie as we see flashbacks of him being made, and because alternate universe Gamora has no rapport with anyone. In fact, she's less likable than she was when we first met her in the first movie. The only times I found myself laughing out loud were at the points where the group was goofing off together, and it was usually some one-liner tossed out by Dave Bautista's Drax. Put in the right movies, this group could have made these for a long time. It's sad we're likely done now. Then there's the bad. I've already mentioned the forgettable villain, so there's not much to add there. At one point, Gunn practically made a joke at the villain's expense in the movie where Peter tells old Stretchy Face that he's not interested in hearing another speech by some bad guy that wants to take over the universe. It seems to be an admission that there's nothing unique here. Adam Warlock was completely wasted as a character. I am not a serious comic book collector or fan, but even I was aware of Adam Warlock and knew some basics when he was teased at the end of Guardians 2. Like far too many things in the MCU, he was just turned into a gag, which is too bad. When you think of the first two Guardians movies, what was always the glue which held it together? For me, it was Peter's music. Gunn was absolutely brilliant at this the first two, not only choosing music that fit the scenes perfectly, but finding a way to integrate them into the story which felt organic, and which helped us feel the deep connection Peter had to it and his mom through it. We even watched the rest of the team clearly learn to love those 2 cassettes worth of music. It never really seemed like a calculated way of creating a soundtrack to sell, and it was as if the music was another main character. That feeling is gone here. Sure, we saw Ego destroy Peter's Walkman and whichever cassette he had in there at the time in Guardians 2, but we also saw Peter given the Zune just after Yondu's death, which contained 300 songs. And it's not that there's no music here. There is, but there's no longer used the same way. It's not prominently part of the storyline, and very few songs are memorable. I Just Got Out, and other than the Beastie Boys' No Sleep Till Brooklyn, and an acoustic version of Creep by Radiohead, which sets that somber stage for most of the movie in the opening scene, I can't really remember any other specific song in a specific scene. I bet you can do that for tons of ones from the first 2 movies, right? I sure can. Hell, I love the way that was done so much in the first movie that I tried to guess the soundtrack for Guardians 2, and I'll include my list in the description below. I still have this playlist on my phone and I play it all the time. Let me know what you think. But here, when the music is used, it's often not mentioned as part of Peter's, though we know it is. Gunn does force in a music-related mid-credit scene, which just seems odd. Rocket's backstory was not so much powerful and moving as it was just depressing and brutal to watch. We'd already had a good idea what had happened, so to watch these little animals be tortured was a bit out of character, or at least it would have been for the Disney of the past. I didn't feel like I learned anything important or felt any more sympathy for Rocket having to endure any of that. Hell, I already liked him. I am also not a fan of the idea that I have to subscribe to a streaming service and watch every second of content in order to be up to speed to then spend more money to see a movie at the theater. Movies should be self-contained. If it's not in there, then I ought to be able to judge the movie more harshly for failing to provide that information to moviegoers. I'm not talking about movies which have sequels. It's right to assume that if you're watching Volume 2, you've seen the first movie. But to expect viewers to have consumed product on one device in order to consume more product in a different venue is typical Disney and
sheer fucking hubris.
Finally, it's hard not to wonder if we'd have gotten this same movie had it been filmed and produced prior to its originally scheduled 2020 release date. I'm sure we're all familiar with James Gunn's questionable tweet history and how Disney fired him off of Guardians, and how the cast rallied around him to no avail. The end result was that Disney just waited out any consumer anger, but in doing so, it missed the natural window for this movie. Sure, it would have been pushed back or had some crazy release thanks to the virus which must not be named. But the movie would have more faithfully resembled what Gunn had likely intended for the third volume. It's hard not to imagine we'd have gotten a different movie that felt far closer to the first 2 than this one does. Obviously, actions have consequences, but as a fan of the series, I'm bummed we got this instead. So, is this a terrible movie? No, not at all. It's just a typically forgettable entry into what is now the dregs of the MCU. And to me, that's the real travesty, having loved the first 2 volumes so much. What made those first 2 special to me was largely missing here. As for recommending going to see it, it really depends on if you're a completist like me. I tend to hate leaving things undone, so I would have felt wrong not having gone to close out this series. Given this is still a holdover from the heyday of the MCU most of us enjoyed, you may as well go and say goodbye, even if it's not the goodbye you'd have preferred. Or, don't. I'm not the boss of you.